What's a family secret you were only told after you got older? My grandfather did not die of a heart attack in the garage. My grandmother accidentally hit him with the car. I never knew why my grandmother refused to drive anywhere and preferred walking. My father always talked about how his brother lied to a doctor so he could get on disability. I thought it was so easy for anyone to get a disability check. All you had to do was tell your doctor you were abducted by aliens. Years later, my father had a mental breakdown. He started telling stories about the government implanting a chip in his brain. He went out and got a CAT scan as proof, and he would point to things that weren't there. My dad was diagnosed as a schizophrenic, and years later, he started collecting a disability check because he couldn't hold a job. Kind of hard to perform any job when every conversation, including interviews, veers into the government trying to freak me in the ass. As an adult, it dawned on me when my aunt mentioned mental illness runs in the family. My uncle had never lied to his doctor. He told that doctor what he believed to be the absolute truth. He had been abducted by aliens. Last year, I found out my dad isn't actually my biological father. He got my sisters and me those ancestry DNA kits for Christmas to do for fun as a family, and once we got the results, it showed he wasn't my biological father. The freaked up thing is my mom knew the whole time and never told anyone. For 26 years she kept this a secret and never had any intention of telling the truth. When I confronted her about it, she denied, and then once I showed her the results, she finally confessed. She'd had an affair with her college boyfriend while my dad was on a business trip for a couple months. After I found all of this out, things finally started making sense. Her and I have never had a great relationship. I always envied other girls growing up that had great mother/daughter relationships and never understood why that couldn't be me. She was very verbally and sometimes physically abusive towards me growing up, but never towards my sisters. She knew I was the product of her affair, and she was ashamed, so she would take it out on me. I was always told I was 6 weeks premature, but now I know she was lying, so she could keep her timeline straight so my dad wouldn't find out about the affair. She had another affair with my soccer coach when I was 10, which led to my parents' divorce later that year, and blamed me for it. All of her wrongdoings, she would blame me for, and now it all makes sense. She's a really messed up woman. I'm not on speaking terms with her anymore, nor do I really care to meet my biological father. Maybe someday, but I'm not ready to. My relationship with my dad has never been better, and that's all I really care about. I didn't know one of my cousins existed until I was about 10 years old. Turns out he was diagnosed with leukemia as a child, and I was a very sensitive kid, so my family decided not to tell me until the treatment was successful and he recovered. It would have been okay if they told me as soon as he was healthy again, but I guess they forgot. So the first time I met him, I was wondering how exactly I managed to forget the existence of a whole person. My aunt and uncle, who passed away when I was 11, were drug addicts. I adored them, but as I got older I started seeing less and less of them and never understood why. My parents briefly told me when I was 16, and that my uncle didn't die of a brain tumor, actually had one though, but instead he shot himself while my aunt was in the other room, which led to my aunt's drug-related death on New Year's Day. They finally told me the whole story when I was 21. I was the last person to know. Even my little brother knew before me because I was extremely close to them and looked so highly of them. I still do. I wish I would have known sooner, but I understand why they didn't tell me. That my grandfather raped my grandmother, and that's how she conceived my dad. He used to beat my dad unconscious when my dad was as young as 5 years old, and my grandmother did nothing about it. My grandmother then finally left my grandfather, only to be with an alcoholic pedophile who sexually abused young boys in church. She has great taste in men. Explains why my grandmother and father had a strained relationship, and why one Christmas my step-grandfather was covered in bruises. He said he had a fall, but when everything came out about his past, it was actually because a young boy who he'd abused tracked him down years later and beat the living crap out of him. My grandmother was a hard drug addict. She was a nurse and basically nurse Jackied her way into stealing dilaudid hydromorphone from the hospital and shooting it up for a decade or so. I still don't know the real specifics, but this was happening when I was roughly 1 to 10 years old, and I was told about it when I was in my mid-20s. She was never noticeably out of it, but I remember her being super chill every time she watched us, and rarely ever drove us anywhere. Now I understand that she was just stoned sideways and wasn't going to risk driving us kids around while she was under the influence. Another odd thing, when she was stoned she would always eat ice chips. She's sober now and doesn't anymore, but I remember her chomping on ice cubes all day long when we were little. I have an uncle who is a hardcore alcoholic and lived with my grandparents until they passed. We always thought he was just an unmotivated loser. I have another uncle that passed away well before I was born. Got hit by a car coming back from the store getting something for my grandparents. After both grandparents passed, my mom told me that the alcoholic uncle was asked to go to the store, but bribed his little brother to go instead, which led to his death. My grandmother, who I have always held in very high regard, told my alcoholic uncle afterward that his brother would still be alive if he had gone to the store like she asked. I cannot imagine the guilt that would have laid on him, and completely understand why he ended up that way as a result. In my adult life I've found that my uncle is actually a pretty good man, just dealt a shitty hand. My mom was in the hospital, so I flew home. Me and my dad were hanging out getting drunk, and he started telling me family secrets, almost like he was trying to get a reaction out of me. An uncle was molested, an estranged aunt might actually have a different father than we thought, etc. The one that really got me was when he revealed that he used to do coke. I was imagining he meant like in his 20s. I said, when did you stop? And he said, I think you were about 19. Like freaking what, man? My entire childhood? And he said, yup. Did mom know? Yes. How much? About a gram a week. At first it was completely insane to me, but looking back it made a ton of stuff make way more sense. Crazy mood swings, explosive fights. One minute he would be fine, and then suddenly he would be raving about something. I knew he drank, so I always blamed the instability in the house on that. But finding out he was regularly doing coke all my life was both astounding, and it made complete sense. That my grandmother's husband was a pedophile. All of a sudden I knew why my uncle was so weird and would pick me up and carry me away rather than let me stay alone in a room with him. For the longest time I thought my uncle was a real prude. My male cousins could all swim naked or run around in just their swim trunks, but my uncle made me always wear a swimsuit and put on a cover-up when I came out of the pool. He later admitted, if God forbid he touched you, I was making sure no one could try to blame you. They blamed all his other victims for being too tempting. My uncle, bless his heart, wanted to kill that man so bad. For that matter, so did my dad. Finding out the pedo was, well, a pedo, made all of their muttering to each other at family gatherings make so much more sense. Not all that extreme, but it was emotional for me. My grandfather was the typical tough, rugged mountain man. He never expressed emotion, and in fact rarely ever even spoke at family gatherings. He would just sit in the corner drinking beer. I never felt that he and I had a very good relationship, considering I was the weird artsy kid in the family. We didn't have much to talk about because we couldn't relate to each other well. He died of lung cancer 2 years ago. A couple of months after he died I was visiting my parents and my mom pulled out a shoebox that belonged to him filled with sentimental photographs that he kept hidden in his closet. Nobody knew about it until after he died, and they were cleaning his things out. Almost every single photograph was of me. It broke my heart. I wish I would have been closer to him. He clearly loved me a lot more than I thought he did. My mom, aunts, and uncle always called my pap by his first name, not dad or anything. When I was a kid, I thought maybe he just wanted them to call him by his name. Then one day, my mum mentioned something about her dad. I think she means my pap. Nope. My mum was the product of an affair and both men, my gram's first husband and my mum's biological dad, thought of her as their own and basically co-parented. This was in the early 1960s. Both men raised my mum as their daughter until my gram's first husband passed away. And before anyone says anything about my gram, she was married off when she was 16 to an older man to save face for the family. It was not a marriage of love but convenience. She fell in love with my grandpa and had permission from her first husband to peruse the relationship. My dad never called his stepmom anything but her real name, Margaret. He has 7 brothers and sisters and they all called her mom or some form of that. When I got older it turns out my grandpa was actually cheating on my real grandma / my dad's mom with Margaret while she was dying for colon cancer. My dad was 5 when she dies, and as she was dying my dad had to call my grandpa to tell him to come home because she was dying. After that Margaret and her 3 kids moved in, and my dad was forced to live with his sister who was 18 and married. This was late 70s backcountry, so not abnormal for the time. From then until he turned 16, when he decided to move in with his best friend and his mom. So I learned that he probably has always had resentment towards Margaret because of everything that happened when he was so young, and never wanted to call her anything that resembled a mother because that's not what she was to him. My late father was a great dad, went to work, came home every night and nothing was really out of the ordinary, except that he would ask my sisters and I to let him use the money from our piggy banks. My granddad lived with us, and he had a great pension and relatively no bills, so he spoiled us rotten, and would always give us money, because he knew we had it, but told us not to tell anyone, and that he'd give it back. He would also really only have 2 moods, really cranky or extremely sweet. My sisters and I called it his nice face. This was all we knew until I was about in 8th grade. We went to a private school and my dad would tell us school was cancelled. There was a gas leak, Institute AZTC, and we would stay home. When we would go back to school, nobody else would know what we meant as they had been in school. One day, just before my graduation, my mom let out a scream and started screaming. Our house was being foreclosed on and my dad hadn't been paying the mortgage and had been trying to cover up for the fact that he had been a functional cocaine addict. The nice face was when he was high. The school absences were because he'd spent tuition money on drugs and then had to pay before my mom caught wind. Apparently, it had gotten worse by this time, but he'd been an addict for more than 20 years and none of us knew. My father was a capo from the Neapolitan Camorra, was wanted by the Interpol, and couldn't set a foot back in Italy without being immediately apprehended. He was also living under a stolen identity he used when he fled a high security prison in Italy. My last name never was my family name. That and much more. I used to like telling this story when I found out, since everyone thought I was lying or joking anyway. I was 12 and only found out because my mom broke down after father was detained in Spain while we lived in Argentina, which meant he might never come back to us. He escaped prison again a year later. I was an only child and my mother was 40 and father 50 when they had me. They had gotten together rather late in life. My mother always told me that my father didn't want her to get pregnant because he was afraid she was too old and didn't want anything happening to her or the baby. After my father passed away at the age of 95, I took my mother to the Social Security office to take care of paperwork. One of the questions they asked was whether there were any other potential beneficiaries of my father's benefits such as other children or ex-wives. Being an only child, I immediately answered no. My mother looked at me sheepishly and answered, "That's not exactly correct." It was then, at the age of 45 in the Social Security building, that I learned that my father had previously been married in his 20s and had had a child. Mother and baby died during childbirth. It explained why my parents never had children until late at life, and why he had not wanted to. Had a creepy uncle that everybody felt uncomfortable near. He was more annoying than creepy. Anyway, never liked the guy. One day when I was about 17 he asked for a handshake, locked his hand over mine, and said, "Aren't you going to kiss your uncle's hand?" and tried to pull his hand near to my head. I freaked out and said that I was going to beat the crap out of him if he didn't let me go that instant. It sounded way cooler in Portuguese, and when he refused to let me go I overpowered him and managed to land a couple kicks until my father arrived. I stopped thinking that maybe I went too far, but dad started to beat the crap out of him when I told that he asked for a kiss. Later I was informed that my uncle was indeed a sex harasser. My uncle cheated on my aunt when he'd go away on weekends for events related to a hobby a little over a decade into their marriage, and apparently everyone at those weekends knew. My aunt would be home with 3 young kids while he was openly running around with another woman. Finally understood why my dad was always a little weird about him, why one of his kids has had a hot and cold relationship with him, and also why he and my aunt are so into this marriage group thing they do, to the point of always going to conferences, even when money is super tight. Like and subscribe for more Reddit videos.